Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Episcopus Admiratio, or Wandering Bishop, and literally wandering in the sense of thinking and just thinking out loud. For those of you who haven't seen this program before, this is literally just something for me to do on a Monday evening, and really just sort of share my thoughts on various things, maybe vent a bit, maybe let off a bit of steam. Who knows? Now, feel free to interact. If you want to make a comment, then please do. Good evening to everyone who's around so far. So good evening to Barbara and Shirley, and Jane, Father Thomas in Chicago, and others. Welcome. If you have an opinion or have a thought about, or a question about anything that I talk about, then feel free to type in the comments and share it with us, and I may even respond to it and share what you've shared with us as well. So there's lots of things going on at the moment. Some of you know that Father Tom in Chicago and I there on Sunday evenings, hi Colin, have a program called Unscripted, where we discuss current affairs in the church world, as it were. And through the week, we collect news stories and we share them with each other via Messenger and with a couple of other trusted colleagues for opinion and input. And then from that, we kind of decide what the title of the show is and what we're going to talk about. And yesterday, there were various other things that we didn't get round to talking about. Yesterday, we talked about churches reopening, and we didn't really get round to discussing the other issues that were in our messenger chat, as it were. So I may turn to some of those. One of which was a phenomena called what was it called? The UK blessing. The UK blessing. Now, this was a video that went viral on social media and was put together by, I think, something like 65, so over 65 churches in the UK, linked arms during these challenging times for an emotional digital performance of Cody Carnes and Carrie Yobe's Christian anthem, The Blessing. And various people have been reacting to it, some of them extremely emotionally. It came out a couple of weeks ago, hit something like 900,000 viewers within hours of it going live. And the words of it will be familiar to probably most people. The Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you, all around you and within you. He is with you in the morning, in the evening, in your coming and your going, in your weeping and rejoicing. He is for you. And the track, so the video itself, and I won't play it for you because I don't want to get into all the copyright issues, but basically it takes the format of various other musical Zoom sort of conferencey things that various people have put together. So there were singers in this case from different churches around the country singing these lyrics and singing the song, and it was all put together a little bit like Colonel Tom's You'll Never Walk Alone and various other things. And it's done the rounds. Various of the evangelical and charismatic churches have been all over it, very excited about it. A lot of them, of course, contributed to it. But not everyone was immediately impressed or happy about it, including an organization called Brephos, 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 who are a pro-life organization, but who expressed some reservations about the UK blessing phenomena. Now, one of the messages that the Christians who put the UK blessing together wanted to convey was that although we were all in lockdown, the church is still alive, very much alive. And the press releases that accompany the UK blessing say that, you know, the organizations and churches that are involved in the video together have fed something like 400,000 meals they've delivered, and so on and so forth. But Brephos is saying, well, as wonderful as that is, and as wonderful as that all sounds, and as extremely positive as the lyrics are, and as extremely what's the word? Joyful, I suppose, as the sentiment is, and as nice as the sentiment is. Of course, all things in the church are not quite well, even though the church is alive. But the church is not quite well in many respects. And they voiced, you know, some concerns, some opinions. Good evening, Bishop Kelly. They expressed some reservations about it sort of misportraying the church in the UK, because, you know, as wonderful as it is to get over 65 churches together, the reality is that many of those churches ordinarily don't work together. And not as friendly as the video may portray them, and that actually there are various issues, important issues, going on for our nation right now, that the churches might better spend their time and energy addressing, rather than seemingly ignoring. Now, of course, as I say, Brephos is a pro-life charity, and so they are obviously concerned about the rise in unwanted pregnancies, the terminations, the home abortion kits. That's something that you know, the media, for example, hasn't focused on nor reported on widely, and few people perhaps are aware that with the lockdown bill and the regulations that came out, was also a relaxation of abortion termination procedures to allow home kits for women to terminate pregnancies at home. Now, this just seems completely ironic to me, because the whole argument has always been for abortories that you know, it was to get away from the unhygienic and awful conditions and unsafe conditions of backstreet abortions, blah blah blah. Now, anyone who's followed the pro-life or the abortion agendas over the last few years will now realise, of course, that there were, you know, the backstreet stuff was greatly exaggerated. The protagonists of that have admitted that since. But all that aside, the whole point was that you know, it would be better if if women were going to have terminations, that they had them in proper clinics where everything was hygienically arranged, and proper doctors and proper trained nurses were around, etc., etc. And then they go and allow these home termination kits, so that a woman will ring, I don't know, the NHS helpline, I suppose, explain the situation. They'll be sent a kit in the post, which are, but as I understand it, abortifacient pills, which they then self-administer. And presumably there's a leaflet that tells you how to deal with the afterbirth and everything else. And of course, again, last week, didn't hit the mainstream, didn't hit the headlines. Everyone's too preoccupied worrying about a civil servant taking an illicit car journey to his parents than they are about people at home killing their babies. Not to put too fine a point on it, but and it turns out that somebody using one of these home kits presumably hadn't read the instructions or something. And anyway, there were awful complications, in part because she was over 24 weeks gestation, pregnant. So apparently these abortifacient pills are supposed to be for early emergencies rather than for later terminations. But of course, it created all sorts of complications. So Brephos, of course, wanted to make that point and to say, things are not all that rosy, and also to say that God blesses those who bless Him, and that's something. There is an aspect to the Church of Nice, meaning those who those of a universalist bent, to obfuscate somewhat the gospel. That is to say that they'll always talk about God is love. They'll always talk about children of God, for example. Now, actually, properly speaking, scripturally speaking, children of God actually is a phrase that refers to those who have chosen themselves and voluntarily acknowledged themselves to be children of God. In other words, those who have accepted baptism, those who have turned to Christ, those who have accepted the gospel. Truly speaking, the phrase children of God refers to them. It doesn't refer to the whole of humanity, which of course many people think it does, and many people would like to think that it does. Likewise too, while indeed on the one hand scripture says that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, or the righteous and the unrighteous, that's not to say that's a kind of as it were an observation of the way the natural world works. So the wheels of nature keep turning irrespective of whether you're righteous or unrighteous. What it's not saying necessarily is that God's blessing is outpoured upon all, irrespective of whether or not they love Him or not, whether they know Him or not, whether they serve Him or not, whether they are keeping His commandments or not. Now, on the one hand, it's fair enough to accept, as Jesus says, that it's not our place to judge. And certainly it isn't our place to judge, but it's quite another to suggest that God isn't judging, because of course He is. Every sin and transgression that somebody commits is noted. As much as we don't note all the various sins and transgressions we as individuals commit, nonetheless, He who is omniscient, of course, is. It's foolish, as I've said many times in my homilies at Mass. It's foolish to convince ourselves that little sins that we like to think of as little sins don't count, because they do. It all counts. Any sin is transgression of God's law. And of course it counts, it matters. I mean, that's the other thing, we're all too keen generally these days in our society to sort of negate ourselves from responsibility for our own actions. One of the things that gets my goat about the whole Dominic Cumming thing is that, the likelihood is that he did wrong. I missed his live appearance on television moments ago this evening, but from what I could tell quickly from news reports, he didn't make an apology. And whether he should or whether he shouldn't or whatever, to be honest, frankly, to my mind, I'm not really bothered about. But what I can't stand is all the hypocrisy, all these people moralizing about it. If you see the media scrum outside his house, basically harassing his family on their doorstep. Clearly, the journalists, the paparazzi, not observing social distancing. None of them that I could see were wearing a face mask, etc. we know who Dominic Cummings is. Do we need yet another photograph or another clip of him walking in and out of his house or walking down the street? Seriously, do we really? You know, is there a necessity in any way for those paparazzi to be there, for those journalists to be there, for those TV cameras to be there, and for them all to come from different households, or none of whom, they're not social distancing, they're not wearing masks, they're not wearing PPE, they're not, and we're supposed to be moralizing and het up about this single individual, while at the same time they're contravening all the other rules as well. And are we supposed to think, oh well, it's okay for Dominic Cummings to break to ignore the restrictions and the press as well? What's going on there? It just seems incredibly hypocritical to me, and especially when people who are wanting to help women going through difficult or unwanted pregnancies are forbidden from being meters, within 100 meters or 200 meters of abortories, when they're only standing there praying, and they're trying to save lives. It just, I'm sorry, it makes me sick. It makes my blood boil. So there's all these people moralizing. That's the other thing as well, of course, that gets me, is that most of these people doing the moralizing are the first people to tell anybody else moralizing about them, don't judge me or accuse people of bigotry and prejudice and bias and all the other things, all those other negative connotations. It makes it. I'm sorry, but it makes me sick. It's just hypocrisy. It's just wide scale hypocrisy, and it's. I can't stand it. I can't stand it. And then, of course, so talking about moralizing about it, suddenly the Lord's spiritual. So suddenly the bishops of the Church of England, who have been basically silent for weeks during a national pandemic, during a national crisis, who collectively, Archbishop Welby was their spokesperson, but collectively they acquiesced whatever to the restrictions and the guidelines that the Archbishops of Canterbury and York issued, forbidding clergy from going into their own churches to pray, and more or less forbidding them to help hospital chaplaincies, etc. Suddenly they speak up in the House of Lords to moralize over this single individual who, from what I can tell, and of course, and this is being charitable, but from what I can tell, was dealing with what he perceived to be a personal or family crisis in the midst of a national crisis, and wanted to do the best, as he thought at the time, for right or wrong, for his family. And I know that there are hundreds and thousands of people up and down this country who, for much the same, and indeed for lesser reasons, did not observe the lockdown. I mean, if we were, I wonder sometimes what kind of a country people want to live in. I mean, if this is the way things are going, then I could, to use a colloquial term, grass up quite a few of my neighbours. Whose teenage sons have gone out every day during lockdown to meet up with their teenage friends somewhere, I don't know where, but they haven't been observing the lockdown all the way through. I know of friends and family who have gone on journeys. They've travelled wider than a mile or 2 miles to go shopping. I know others, of course, who we all know. Remember, we all know people, whether it's our neighbours, whether it's family, friends, whether it's whatever. We all know people who haven't strictly kept to the guidelines that were given by the lockdown, and long before restrictions were lifted, sort of, for retail shopping last week. Just going to the supermarkets before, when you were legitimately allowed to go to the supermarkets for shopping, the irony was that people keeping 2 meters apart outside the store, but as soon as they were in the store, nobody was minding social distancing then, were they? You'd be standing there thinking, have they looking for your brand of bread? And sure enough, somebody, as in days of normalcy, will just reach across from behind you and grab whatever it is they want. No social distancing there. Face mask or no face mask. And that's something else as well, isn't it? All these face masks. It seems logical to me that, you see, the whole point of wearing a face mask is that if you sneeze, you won't get it on everyone else. That's really the point of it. That's the only kind of practical application that the face masks have, because according to scientists and to medical personnel, what they won't do is they won't stop the virus reaching you. The mesh inside a face mask is just not small enough to prevent a virus. It might prevent certain types of bacteria. The highest grade face mask that is generally used in hospitals, etc., was designed to keep out TB bacteria, for example. But it's also a known fact, apparently. I didn't realize this, but it makes sense. But it's also a fact that wearing a mask for an extended period of time, breathing in your own CO2, is not necessarily, a great and healthy thing to do either. So anyway, but all this talk about face masks. Now, does anybody else remember that, 6 weeks ago, the world was screaming for PPE and screaming about face masks? Now, all of a sudden, they're widely available. Anybody can get one. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry is supposed to have one. And I haven't seen, we haven't heard anything about there being a crisis or shortage of getting them. And where does one get them? That's the weird thing as well. I know they're available on Amazon and eBay and things like that, but suddenly some shops and some places are insisting on people wearing a face mask. But where does the ordinary person get them from? The last we heard, PPE was supposed to be strictly reserved for medical personnel and carers. Now all of a sudden we're all supposed to wear it. Where do we get it from? Suddenly there's been what? They've suddenly released a mountain of it. I don't know. It's crazy stuff going on. I digressed a little there. Oh yeah, people moralizing about Dominic Cummings. So there they are, the Lords Spiritual, their lordships and their ladyships in the House of Lords, waxing lyrical, moralizing over one man and his quite probable mistake. But on all sorts of other issues, important issues that have been discussed, they've kept quiet. They've kept quiet. So the sending out of these do-it-yourself abortion kits at home, no comment. Various legislation and stuff going through about kids with gender identity confusion, etc. No comment. Nothing. Churches being locked down and clergy being forbidden to go into them. Nothing. They just left all of that to Welby. All of a sudden, over this one man who, in a desperate situation, in a crisis situation, made the wrong probably decision from what anyone can tell, then suddenly they're all standing up one after the other to moralise about it. And I mean, like a dozen of them at least, and various of them tweeting about it. Didn't issue any tweets about services over Easter and how everyone's supposed to cope with the restrictions and everything that they sent out. Nothing, not a word about that. Didn't tweet about that. But this one chap, this civil servant, suddenly everyone's on their moral high horse. It's crazy, absolutely crazy. There's Bishop Paul there. Streets of Portsmouth are literally strewn with cast-off face masks and latex gloves. Yeah, I can believe that. I can believe that. And if I left, if I went wider than the sort of just about a mile that I've constrained and limited myself to, bar one occasion in the past 7 weeks, no doubt I'd probably see evidence of that as well here in Brighton. And that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, again, these face masks, you can't wear them. You're not supposed to wear them for extended periods of time. You're supposed to change them. And latex gloves. I mean, everyone knows with latex gloves, all these things are disposable. And of course, if you're in a hospital in a PPE situation, these things are supposed to be disposed of in a particular way. They become sort of biohazard material in the sense that they can be stained with whatever virus, bacteria, and what germs and all sorts stuck on them. You're supposed to take them off in a particular way. You're supposed to dispose of them in a particular way. They're supposed to go in particular bins, and they're disposed of. Those bins are collected and disposed of in a particular way. So again, it's kind of pointless. Everybody walking around wearing these face masks and swapping them every 5 minutes and just throwing them, willy nilly. And the same with latex gloves. And from what I can tell, and I've been, reading fairly widely, both sides of the pond, and further afield again, particularly from Italy and Spain. From what I can tell, the only sound advice really boils down to that which we were told 2 months ago, which is essentially to wash your hands. Wipe down surfaces and wash your hands. And if you sneeze, use a disposable handkerchief, disposable tissue, whatever, and dispose of it in a plastic bag. Tie it up and then put it in your rubbish. And as far as I know, that's from the WHO and from the NHS, I haven't seen anything contrary to that advice. I don't know if anyone else has, but I haven't seen anything contrary to that advice. That's still basically their advice. And I remember as well distinctly at the time, 2 months ago, or is it longer? I don't know now. But also being told that the latex gloves were not something to use because they just spread. They just spread things around. I can't remember if that's still relevant or not, but certainly, the advice that's coming out in those places now that are coming out of lockdown, they're still saying, wash your hands, disposable handkerchiefs and plastic bags. So rather ironically, all this angst and worry that's been generated, for the last however long. Somebody tell me, is it 2 months or 3 months we've been in lockdown now? I really don't know. Has all been for nothing, really, because it's all gone full circle. It's all gone full circle. So it still remains that the best advice is just wash your hands and blow your nose or cough into disposable hankies, tie them in plastic bags and put them in the bin. Nothing more you can do. And if that really is the situation, then that does beg the question, then, well, should we come out of lockdown then? Do we need these restrictions? 23rd of March, lockdown was announced. Thank you, Bishop Paul. And it's the 25th of May now. So that's 2 calendar months and probably a couple more weeks, I'd have thought. There's Father Rich there. In the USA, we get so many mixed messages from the government and health professionals. Well, there, I mean, in the States, of course, you're dealing with, you've got the federal government saying things, you've got the WHO saying things, you've got the CDC saying things, and you've got every state saying things, every governor of every state saying things. And then you've got your county officials and everything else, and your mayoral cities under that as well. And then that's my point, is that for all this confusion, for all this, mixed advice and all the rest of it, apparently what it all boils down to still is washing your hands and staying away from each other is the best way, is the best thing to do, is the only thing you can do. Now, I mean, I know that in the ecclesial world, and we sort of, Father Thomas and I were discussing that yesterday on air, but again, there are mixed opinions about whether or not churches should reopen, and whether or not masses should be said publicly again, whether or not people should receive, and how they should receive. What's the best way for to receive? I've seen photos today on Facebook of people in chapel veils and big masks over their mouths and noses. Looking vaguely strange, but on the other hand, of course, we've seen the joy, the real joy of the faithful in Italy being able to return to public masses, but then we've heard tragic stories of, was it 40 people in Frankfurt in Germany at a Baptist church who all got infected after the lockdown restrictions were raised so they could go back to church. They all got infected. It's a crazy world, but it does seem to me that fundamentally then really what everyone ought to do is wash their hands, stay away from each other, which is rather sad, of course. Is a bit of a pity, but if it will save lives, you see, and that's the thing, and I think that's the thing that people forget about this coronavirus, is it's insidious. It's the insidious nature of it. There are lots of people saying, "Oh, well, it's like any other type of virus or flu." Well, to an extent, yes, except that it is particularly lethal. It is particularly dangerous. The vast majority of people who might get infected, on the whole, as long as they are averagely healthy, will survive it. I mean, they'll be some of them, or most of them, will experience it'll be a not nice experience for a few days, but on the whole they'll recover and they'll be fine. But there are a huge group of people, or groups of people, for whom this virus is not like other flus. So that the elderly particularly, it's particularly dangerous for them. It's particularly dangerous for people with underlying health conditions, heart conditions, lung conditions, even diabetes and things. There's of all ages and all demographics. But that said, we know, again, particularly poorer people, it's dangerous for them. Particularly BME people seem particularly affected, and we know that it kills more men than it does women. So I don't think we can sort of generalize it and say lump it all together with ordinary flu, even though ordinary flu actually on the whole kills more people, blah 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 blah. I know. I've read it all. I have read it all. It's it's very confusing. But the thing that the thing about coronavirus is the insidious nature of it is that it is particularly lethal to those who are susceptible to it. It is particularly, thank you, Ray, there, 10 times more lethal than ordinary flu. And that's the thing, isn't it? The trouble is, you see, again, well, like all viruses, we don't know exactly how people pass it on. But again, read the insidious nature of it all. People can be asymptomatic carriers of it. There are people walking around who are infected who don't know that they're infected because they have no symptoms. And the trouble is that they, and particularly if they're behaving as I have seen most people behave, if they're not washing their hands regularly, if they're not wearing face masks to catch their own sneezes, if they're not sneezing into disposable handkerchiefs and things, if they're wiping their hands over everything, they are infecting other people. And it may be completely unintentional in the sense that they have no idea that they're carrying it. But the trouble is, it's so potentially lethal for not a small section of our population. It affects a lot of groups and really negatively. So I can't share, I'm afraid, the opinion of many on on the right, shall we say, or I mean, I would describe myself really as a small C conservative. Some of you may disagree, but that's how I perceive myself. So it must be true. But I generally consider myself a small C conservative, and I can't go along with a lot of those on the right and others who are saying, who are trying to diminish the insidious nature of this virus, and sort of saying, well, we can catch anything anytime, we can never be 100% safe. That's all true. I know that's all true. I understand that. I do appreciate that. But I'm not sure that they're necessarily appreciating how dangerous this flu is, this virus is, to large sections of the population. So, as I've said, really from the beginning, I've always been a bit ambiguous about it all, because it's very difficult to be able to make, I think, a properly informed and consistent position, except for safety's sake, except to err on the side of caution. And I know that's particularly hard. I know that's difficult. We are, as humanity, we are a social. We're social beings. But frankly, for most of us, we're not. Although we might be in isolation, we're not in we're not in soul isolation. And many of us, of course, are doing a lot to address those who are in social isolation, to ensure that they're okay, and to ensure that they're not lonely, to ensure that they get what they need and they're looked after. And indeed, as I've said before, I think one of the positives from this whole experience is the fact that so many people have reached out and volunteered to help others in all sorts of ways. And long may that continue. I hope that carries on. That would be, I think one of the big pluses, one of the big positive developments of this contagion is the amount of neighborliness and goodwill that it has inspired in people, and I would hope that continues. But on the other hand, there is a minority which is rather selfish, and has not consistently followed the lockdown. I mean, that's why the infection rates and the death rates, we're not seeing big drops. We're not seeing big drops, and that's the other thing, isn't it? I was talking about people moralizing earlier, but that's the other thing. Do we start policing each other? Do we really want to live in a society that does that, though? But should we be policing it? Should we be saying to those neighbours that we know, that we've seen, who aren't practicing social distancing, who aren't covering and protecting themselves and others from them, from sneezes and coughs and things, should we become policing of each other? And on the other hand, of course, I understand all the arguments, all the economic arguments, and indeed some of the psychological arguments for easing the restrictions. I get that as well. People need income, people need their jobs, people need their livelihoods, people need to be able to sustain themselves and their families and their dependents and their homes. Obviously, things have got to be lifted. I think I don't know. I think there could be a way through, which is simply to insist that everybody enforces social distancing as much as possible. And we go back to where we were before the lockdown, everybody washing their hands, everybody catching their sneezes. Maybe that is the way to go forward. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. And, I apologize to some who might expect me to be a little more decisive about it. But I don't see how I can be. I don't see how I can be. There's if I'm to exercise prudence, then I have to look at all the evidence. And at the end of the day, it is about lives. It is about lives. And I don't go, and I'm sorry, but I don't go for that strain of thought or argument that some are pushing from the religious perspective, that well, hang it all, we can receive the Holy Eucharist without fear, and we should have access to the sacraments, and blah 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 blah. I don't quite go along with all of that, because we are supposed to exercise prudence. And often when I hear those sort of arguments, I'm reminded of the devil and our Lord in the wilderness, and our Lord saying, "Thou shalt not test the Lord thy God." Then I would counter, I would dare anyone to try and accuse me of having a lack of faith. Just try. You won't win on that score. But it's not all about me, and it's not all about my faith. And as a bishop, and of the brother bishops that I've spoken to, the brother bishops that I've observed in their comments and things in elsewhere, I think prudence requires us to be careful, to be really careful, and to urge others to be careful, if only because some people are not very good at looking after themselves, let alone considering others, let alone looking after others. Part of me would love to, if our nation had been really good at observing the lockdown, then a part of me might be persuaded now to say, well, yeah, you can trust us. Or even to say, yeah, I can trust my neighbors. I can trust my local community. But I can't. And it's not because I'm fearful for myself. It's because I'm fearful for others. I'm cautious enough and sensible enough and responsible enough to be able to look after myself and to ensure, I'm washing my hands and catching my sneezes and blah, blah, blah. I can do all that. I can wipe down surfaces here, there, and everywhere. That's not a problem. It's not for myself that I'm worried about. But it's for the weak and the vulnerable. And that includes sometimes the weak of mind and the weak of purpose and the weak of common sense. And as many of you who know me well know that I don't suffer fools gladly. I know it's a fault that I'm to work at, and I am. But some fools don't need encouragement to be foolish. And we shouldn't give them the opportunity, frankly. And I know that, most of you will understand where I'm coming from, because like I say, we all know that while on the whole, collectively as a nation, we did pretty well for 2 months, pretty well. But we know there were lots of people who didn't. And that's why we're umming and ahhing now. That's why the infection rate and the death rates have not gone down, have not dropped drastically. Because a lot of people have not been, couldn't be trusted. A lot of people couldn't be trusted. Bless you, Ray. Thank you for that. And yes, part of the problem that I see going forward, re the financial economic situation, is that there is going to be a lot less money around. But what also concerns me is that, we've given a lot of stuff away already. Now, don't get me wrong. The Lord loves a cheerful giver. Everyone who's been working in the field, ensuring that people have had supplies and have had food, so on and so forth. Everyone's been, of course, they've been happy and willing to give and to donate, but that itself cannot go on forever. I'm kind of conscious of the fact that these 2 months, not to put too a finer point on it, but a lot of free food, a lot of free stuff has been given away that, is free to those who receive it, of course. A lot of it has been freely given, but there is a cost to that somewhere, somewhere there is a cost to that. And my concern is that going forward, I just can't see how going forward there will not be economic problems. People are going to have financial problems for a long time. There are some occupations, some industries that are just not going to return to work for a long time. Some of you know that I have a great many friends from a former passion and career of mine in entertainment, many in the arts industry, many musicians, performers, who are struggling now and are going to continue to struggle. Theatres that are not going to be open for a long, long, long time. And you know, and of course, you know, people of faith will continue to give as much as they can give, but don't forget that they are themselves, all of them, dependent on income. All of them are depending on the economy as well. And like I say, I'm conscious of the fact that a lot of free stuff has been given away, and I should finish that thought, to people who are not actually necessarily financially pressed. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, not saying that we begrudge what's been given at all, what's been given away. No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that a lot of the people who have been recipients were recipients more because they were vulnerable and in vulnerable situations than necessarily because they were under financial stress. You know, the government didn't stop paying out people's pensions. The government didn't stop paying out people's benefits. Now, you know, I know all the arguments. Don't get me wrong. I know all the arguments that, you know, those in receipt of state pensions and those and reliant upon them, those who are in receipt of state benefits and reliant upon them, it's not enough. I know. But my point is that whereas before our level of giving was, as it were, to prop up the shortfall, over these past 2 months, the generosity in giving has far exceeded and outweighed that. And what concerns me is that if going forward, we may already have given away a lot of stuff that we perhaps should have held on to. I mean, obviously, all the fresh produce, etc., you know, that has to go out as soon as it comes in, more or less. But all of the dry goods, a lot of the dry goods stuff, a lot of the tin stuff, and all the rest of it, that's all been going out as well. And that concerns me that, you know, in the future, in the not too distant future either, there's not going to be enough of that stuff to meet the demand, which will be for people who really are financially struggling. Does that make sense? Somebody let me know. Do you see what I'm saying? Where I'm coming from? Now, again, of course, people of goodwill and people of faith will continue to give and sacrificially give as much as they can. Anyone who listens to my homilies knows that I'm always saying that you must give and give more to cost yourself. It has to be a sacrifice. But we're sort of, in this respect, we are kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. But Peter and Paul will be, if they're not already beginning to be, in the same position. You know, so, you know, like I say, you know, thank you, Bishop Paul. You know, believe me, that nobody wants to you know, to stop giving. But what I'm concerned about, that there may come a point where being able to give becomes problematic because there isn't enough. So, yeah, you know, and I'm only thinking aloud here. You know, I haven't got the answer. I haven't got the answers to these questions. I'm just thinking out loud. But that's one of the things that that concerns me going forward. If we have to persist in lockdown, you know, even if with some, you know, slight easing of restrictions here or there, but if essentially we have to continue in this lockdown, and I don't see in some respects why we shouldn't, except for the economic aspect that is going to have an economic and financial put on it. Yeah. Right, bless you. Thank you, Father Tom, for alerting me to that. I am over getting towards the end of my allotted time, because I do try to limit these things to about an hour, so that you'll come back tomorrow for the other show. But like I say, that's what Monday evening. That's what this is about. It's just me venting and just sort of sharing, thinking out loud. I don't claim to have any answers during this program necessarily, but these are things that we all need to think about. We all need to think about, because what's clear, frankly, is that we can't leave it all to the so-called experts. Then I'm the first to admit the limitations of my own capabilities, and I'm first to give hat tips to and recognise those with greater capabilities in other spheres. But as much as I do appreciate and have appreciated, particularly the scientists involved, leaving it all to science, which we were continually hearing from the ministers, was not really thinking strategically and operationally in a wider sense. And yeah, I think that's why we're in the predicament that we're in now. There we go. Anyway, bless you. Thank you all for watching. I hope it was interesting. Sorry I haven't got any answers, but if you'd like to proffer any, then then please do. But I think it is time, as much as it's been great at generating goodwill and caring for each other, I think as well, none of us who have been blessed with brains and expertise and knowledge in various ways should think that we can just sit back and allow others to direct when we can clearly see fault or the locks of potential in what could be done. We collectively need to come together and think about this. And no, I'm not talking about one world government before anybody starts getting paranoid. I'm just saying that read the parable of the talents. We, all of us individually, have been gifted and blessed in various ways with skills, talents, and abilities, and we should all seek to maximize them. And in this situation, seek to maximize them for the benefit of everyone, and not leave it to a few, especially when we think or perceive that they are missing tricks or making mistakes. Send an email to the government department, whatever. Don't keep your opinion to yourself. Share it. If you have expertise and you think they're going wrong, suggest something, because it just may be sometimes, and particularly in a crisis situation, that people can't see the wood for the trees. And I think there's been a lot of that going on. Of course, they won't admit that, but I think there's been quite a bit of that going on in the upper echelons of our society, of our government, that they've been panicking. I mean, just look at this fiasco over Dominic Cumming. All this over a civil servant. Ridiculous. 20, 30 years ago, this wouldn't be a thing. So I think they're panicking at the top. I think they can't see the wood for the trees, and I think they probably would welcome any ray of sunshine or light bulb inspiration. And we owe it to each other to do what we can, wherever we can, and however we can. Anyway, that's enough sermonizing from me. God bless you. Thank you for watching. Tomorrow evening from obviously at 6 o'clock is the Regina Caeli. At 6:15 is a spiritual conference. So more about that in the advance notices. Otherwise, that was a wandering bishop, and I hope to see you all online in the usual way soon. Meanwhile, stay safe, stay clean, stay away from each other. Pray for us all. God bless you.